In John chapter 5, Jesus performs another one of his signs, which points to his heavenly identity. He heals the lame man on the Sabbath, leading to a controversy with Jewish authorities over what can and cannot be done on the Sabbath. Before we look at what biblical scholarship has to say about this story, let's read the text. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now notice that verse 4 is missing from this translation. We'll discuss that later. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath. It is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were prosecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Let's begin with this note that he went up to Jerusalem. Remember that Jesus has been in Cana of Galilee. Going up to Jerusalem means that there is an ascension here. Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level, and Jesus most likely would not have a straight shot, as the arrow on the right of the screen would indicate. He most likely went down and traveled along the Jordan River, which means that from the Jordan River below sea level up to Jerusalem would have been a solid 3,500-foot climb from the river to Jerusalem. So this makes sense that he would say he went up to Jerusalem. The author knows something about the land of Israel because he is an eyewitness as he claims to be. He lived there. Now it says that there was a feast of the Jews, and this is interesting because elsewhere we are told what feast it is. Here it's anarthrous. It just says a feast. It doesn't tell you what feast. He sort of leaves it open. And this has led to all sorts of speculation among interpreters as to which feast can be aligned with the events that take place here. But it's more likely that John tells us it's a feast only to explain why Jesus is in Jerusalem at the time. If John wants you to know what feast it is, he would tell you. He's left this open intentionally. He doesn't want you to know what feast it is because in this instance, it is not germane to the story. Now, usually it is germane. Usually, which Jewish festival is taking place is fundamental to explaining some of the actions of Jesus and especially some of the sayings of Jesus. But in this instance, that is not so. The point is that the Sabbath is the basis of all the feasts. Before we move on to talk about Hanukkah and Tabernacles, two of the feasts that will be coming up, and then Passover again, we need to first talk about Sabbath because Sabbath is sort of the basis of all the feasts. In fact, the festivals oftentimes incorporated Sabbaths. The Passover begins with the Sabbath, and a week later ends with the Sabbath. Same thing with Tabernacles. The first and eighth days of the Tabernacle celebration would be considered Sabbaths. And so since Sabbath is a sort of consecrated time where you put away your things and focus on the Lord's things, the festivals were like super Sabbaths, as it were. They are much larger versions of the Sabbath. So before we move on to festivals, we must deal, as it were, with the most fundamental, the most basic festival, Sabbath, the day of the Sabbath is holding up all the other festivals. So it makes sense to the author here, as someone who is well acquainted with Jewish things, to begin with Sabbath. Verse 2, Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. As Keener tells us, most commentators continue to prefer the site of the twin pools beneath St. Anne's Monastery, which excavators identified as the Pool of Bethesda, and you can see that excavation site here on the screen. The pools were apparently as large as a football field and about 20 feet deep. The 5 porticos represent a porch on each of the 4 sides, and then one that separates the 2 pools, perhaps to separate the men from the women, we're not sure. The pool to the north is smaller than the one to the south. The structure, 7 or 8 meters deep, gathered much rainwater. And this pool would eventually become a pagan site in the 2nd century, but there is little or no reason to think it was pagan in the 1st century. It was Jewish, and it was likely rededicated after Jews lost autonomy over the city. Now here I provide a different picture of the same site of excavation. Now it's interesting that the copper scroll, which was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you can see it pictured here on the screen, attests to the pool's existence prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the same name, by Bethesda. In the pool where you enter is a small basin, is what it says in 3Q15. Now, there are many variants in John's manuscripts of how this is spelled, and it's spelled slightly differently also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but nevertheless, the spellings are always similar enough to tell that we are in fact talking about the same location. And it is not just in John's Gospel that we find this. We have found attestation to it in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's a reconstruction of what it might have looked like. Now, interpreters used to suggest that this is not historically reliable information when John says that there was a pool with 5 roofed colonnades, because that wouldn't make any sense. Why would it need 5? It seems like it would have 4, one on each side. But when excavators discovered this, they seen that there was a colonnade running down the center, separating a smaller pool from a larger pool. Again, the smaller pool was likely for the women, and the larger pool was likely for the men. And so now, on the basis of archaeology, what John has said is vindicated here. Something that made no sense began to make sense once we found material evidence of it. And this gives you a better sense of Bethesda within the larger context of Jerusalem and the Temple Mount in the Second Temple period. Most scholars are going to date the Gospel of John to the 80s or especially to the 90s, which is well on after the Romans have destroyed the temple in 70 AD. However, there are some who believe that John writes early in the 60s when Jerusalem is still standing, and this is a proof text. A.T. Robinson is one of those who suggested this. It says, Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. He doesn't say there was in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool. If Jerusalem's already been destroyed and this gospel is written in the 80s or 90s, you might expect him to say there was in Jerusalem. But since John says there is in Jerusalem, this seems to suggest that Jerusalem is still standing, and hence the Romans have not yet come and destroyed it. Now, some will go with Robinson on that, but most are going to go with Michaels and suggest it is a historical present, inviting the reader to visualize the scene as it unfolds. The gospel writers will do this often. They will tell their stories in the present tense to invite the reader to come and to be present, to live in the story world as though it's happening right in front of them. Now, a historical present is very common in the Gospels, and therefore it's likely the better option, and A.T. Robinson and others are probably grasping when they try to use this text to date the Gospel so early. Now, as far as the story itself goes, I'd like to point out that like most of the preceding chapters, water will be replaced by something better. In John 2, we encountered the water pots at Cana, which were used for water purification rites. Jesus turns the water into wine. In chapter 3, you have more discussions of water, a much debated statement by Jesus that you have to be born of water and the Spirit. Then in chapter 4, you have water upstaged again, the water of Jacob's well. If you drink of it, you will be thirsty again. But if you drink of the water that Jesus has to offer, you will never thirst again. And now here we are in chapter 5 at this pool, which was reputed to have healing properties. And Jesus is going to upstage this water as well, just as he upstaged the water at Cana, just as he upstaged the water in Samaria at Jacob's well, so he will upstage this water as well. The healing properties that are attributed to this water are more properly attributed to Jesus. He is the one who will heal. In this water theme that is so much more prominent in John's gospel than in the other gospels. It's all coming in to John 7, where Jesus will explain that the water is representative of the Spirit, which is going to be poured out when he believes. And the Dimiana, the great climax of this water theme in John, is coming at the crucifixion. Remember, in John, only John is going to record for us that when Jesus is stabbed, water comes out of his side. And there's all sorts of things going on there. This not only caps off the great water theme in John's gospel, we have exchanges with a number of Old Testament texts in Leviticus, in Genesis, and Zechariah, and especially in Ezekiel. But it also says something to the Jews in John's world, in the Second Temple period. There's much discussion in ancient Jewish texts about why the Holy Spirit had not been given in that period, why it had not yet been poured out, why it had been withdrawn from the prophets. And John seems to offer contemporary Jews an answer. The reason the Spirit had not been poured out is because the Son of God had not yet been glorified upon the cross. Remember that in this gospel, the cross is enthronement. It is the throne of Jesus. When he is upon it, God's dominion over the world is being exercised, and it's an invitation to us for participation. We never reign more with Christ than when we suffer with him on the cross. In verse 3, in these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. The remainder of verse 3 and all of verse 4 cannot be found in the earliest manuscripts, though it may be retained in many English versions in brackets and is also part of the running text for the King James Bible. Waiting for the moving of the water, for an angel of the Lord went down at certain seasons into the pool and stirred the water. Whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was healed of whatever disease he had. This entire section in red is late and most assuredly was not written by John. Otherwise, it wouldn't be absent from so many early manuscripts, it wouldn't have so many variations in wording in later manuscript, and it wouldn't employ so many vocabulary words that John does not use in other places. So as far as we are concerned, for the sake of discerning what John actually wrote, the remainder of verse 3 and all of verse 4 should be left out of the text, and overwhelmingly, biblical scholars agree with this judgment. There is an interesting relationship between the healing of the lame man in chapter 5 and the healing of the blind man in chapter 9. In both instances, the history of the affected person is described. In chapter 5 and verse 4, the lame man is described as having been lame for 38 years. And in chapter 9 and verse 1, the blind man is described as having been blind since his birth. In both instances, Jesus takes the initiative to make contact with the affected person. In the story of the lame man, the Pool of Bethesda is described as having healing powers. In the other story, there is also a pool, the Pool of Siloam, and after Jesus heals the man, he is told to go and bathe in the pool. Jesus heals on the Sabbath. In both stories, this is controversial. Now this is interesting, these next 2 points. With the lame man, the Jews accuse him of violating Sabbath, and the Jews ask who healed him. Now this is important because there's this big controversy about John's Gospel. It often takes this group of people it calls the Jews and puts them in a negative light. And so the question is raised, is it attacking the entire Jewish race or just Jewish leaders and authorities? Well, when we compare this over with the blind man, it it is clearly the case that it's just Jewish leadership. The Pharisees accused Jesus of violating Sabbath, and Pharisees asked who healed him. And so these stories are clearly meant to be on a par with one another, clearly meant to be compared. And notice that the way John uses the Jews is interchangeable with how he uses the Pharisees. Here and a number of other places, we can see that John is not anti-Semitic, as many have accused, but rather when he says Jews in a negative sense, he is usually talking about the Pharisees or the temple authorities, not every Jewish person. The healed person doesn't know where or who Jesus is. This is a common trope in the Gospel of John, that Jesus is not known or understood. Jesus finds him and invites belief after the healing. Now, in the instance of the lame man, it says Jesus implies a relationship between his sin and suffering. We'll talk more about that in a moment. In the instance of the blind man, Jesus rejects sin as explanation for the man's suffering. The man goes to the Jews, that is, the lame man who is healed, and many see this as a betrayal. Compare this to the blind man. The Jews cast him out because he is more for Jesus than he is for the Jewish authorities. Jesus works as his Father is working. Jesus does the work of the one who sent him. Verses 5 and 6. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" Now, there is a question of translation when it says that Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there. Should it be translated that Jesus learned that he had already been there a long time, or should it be that he knew that he had already been there a long time? Learning implies that, in the NIV goes this way, the New English translation goes this way, that Jesus shows up and he finds out somehow. He learns that the man had been lying there for a long time. And then other translations, like the NASB and the ESV, choose to translate the verb as he knew, in the sense that Jesus already has supernatural knowledge. So does Jesus have supernatural knowledge of this man's condition, or does he show up and learn it from others? Well, it's most likely, I think, that there is supernatural knowledge here. And the reason I say this is because this is a motif throughout the gospel. Jesus has supernatural knowledge of Simon in chapter 1, of the Samaritan woman in chapter 4, of Nathanael, again, back in chapter 1. And so others will come into contact with Jesus, and Jesus will consistently know things about them. And since this is so common in the gospel, we should probably translate it as Jesus knew that he had already been there a long time, not that he learned it. The man has been lying there for 38 years, a very specific number. The question is, does it mean anything? Does it mean anything that the man has been lying there for 38 years? What does this number mean in Scripture? Well, consider this passage about the wilderness wanderings and the children of Israel on their way to the promised land. In the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation, that is, the men of war, had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. For 40 years, God led the children of Israel around in the generation to kill off that first generation of unbelief. They did not believe in the promises of the Lord, and so they were constantly complaining. And after they had tempted the Lord 10 times, he had decided to kill off the first generation and start fresh with the second generation. Now, if you ask anyone how long was this generation of wandering, and they'll tell you 40 years. However, not all of that was punishment. They spent a year at Mount Sinai, and then another year on this, that, and the other, leaving Egypt, and then leaving Mount Sinai to head toward the Promised Land, etc. 2 years of the 40-year wanderings were necessary. Only 38 years was punishment for their persistent complaining. Now, this is interesting because this man is a complainer. Jesus asks him if he wants to be healed, and instead of just saying, "Yes, I want to be healed," he begins to complain about his situation. Well, whenever the water is stirred, somebody gets down in there before me, and so on. Interesting that it would specifically point out 38 years as a lame man. Remember, the children of Israel were invalid. They were lame in a sense. They were stuck out in the wilderness. They were trying to go somewhere but couldn't go. They were trying to get to the promised land and weren't able. This man is also trying to get somewhere and he can't get there. And the first thing he does is complain. He is strangely reminiscent of the first generation of Israelites who came out of the land of Egypt. And this may help us explain some of the elements of the story. Consider what Keener says. The troubling of the waters might suggest an allusion to the Exodus. The same language appears in Psalm 77, which depicts the time when God led his people like a flock by Moses and Aaron, and that entire psalm assures its hearers that the God who acted in the past Exodus would act again. Consistently, the end of the exile and the arrival of the kingdom of God in Old Testament prophecy is compared to a new Exodus. This is why there is so much Exodus language surrounding Jesus. And here we are. We have 38 years. We have this complaining. We have troubling of the waters. We specifically have the mention of the sheep's gate as the context of this story. That may not be a trivial detail because Moses and Aaron in the Exodus are discussed in relationship to the children of Israel as being shepherds who lead sheep. All of these things seem to be echoes to throw us back to the story of the Exodus because Jesus has arrived on the scene as a new Moses who is leading the people on a new Exodus to a better promised land. The sick man answered him, Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I am going, another steps down before me. Jesus said to him, Get up, take up your bed, and walk. The very unfortunate circumstance that attached itself to the Pool of Bethesda is that those most in need of healing would have been the least likely to receive it. It is clear that the stirring of the water, with the incurring benefit that one could be healed, was only occasional, and those who were invalid, those who were immobile, unable to place themselves into the water, would not have been able to partake of the healing benefits of the stirring of the water. Those who needed it the most would have been the least likely to receive it, and that's very unfortunate. Brian states that this story points to an understanding of God as one whose power sometimes operated as an impersonal force occasionally found within the water. Just because the Jewish people were privy to good revelation about God, they knew the real God, they had some knowledge of things that were true, doesn't mean that we can altogether disassociate them from superstitious tendencies. This way of thinking that we're going to localize God within the waters, his healing powers, his desire to heal, that it's stuck in this domain. Well, that is contravened by Jesus. He shows us that God is not an impersonal force, but rather that he is personal. He's become embodied in the person of Jesus. And it might provide a thematic link to important religious rites in previous chapters. Think of John the Baptist in chapter 1. He is baptizing at the Jordan River, but Jesus comes along and supersedes John's baptism. Or think of chapter 2, where you have the water pots in Cana, which are used for ritual purification, and Jesus supersedes these when he turns it into wine. A similar sort of thing might be taking place here, that these places where you have these water rites for religious significance, that Jesus is superseding these. Finally, the spoken work of creation. Remember the setting in Genesis. The Spirit is hovering over the waters, and God speaks creation into existence. So now you have Jesus at the waters, and it's the spoken word that heals the man, that restores the man, that makes him a new creation, as it were. We have these settings in the life of Jesus, which are a throwback to the creation story. And remember, John intends this. His gospel begins with the words, in the beginning, just like the book of Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning. And so these Genesis echoes that we are discerning are not likely just within our head. These are likely intended allusions. We also have other fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. This association between healing and water makes it necessary that we have stories like in John chapter 5 at the Pool of Bethesda, or the Pool of Siloam in John chapter 9. This association between healing, new creation, water, all these things are converging in the ministry of Jesus. I want to also point out a synoptic connection in Mark chapter 2 and verse 9, which is easier to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise, take up your bed and walk. Now that story was in Galilee. This one is in Jerusalem. And so it appears that it's not happenstance that Jesus keeps having these Sabbath controversies, that he heals folks on the Sabbath and he says, take up your bed and walk. It looks rather that he's being intentional about finding those who are lame on the Sabbath, healing them, and having them carry their beds. He seems to be specifically trying to provoke the conversation about the Sabbath. And remember that according to Luke's gospel, Jesus begins his ministry on the Sabbath by quoting a Jubilee text in Isaiah, which is, Jubilee is sort of a super Sabbath. So when Jesus says he is Lord of the Sabbath, it's because the kingdom he ushers in is sort of a big version of the Sabbath. We have Sabbath theology that is operable in the ministry of Jesus. Finally, there is likely a sort of a parabolic, a moral application here. One saved spiritually by Jesus must get up and walk accordingly, remembering that walk is a very common metaphor in the Bible, but especially in the Gospel of John, for obedience, for taking the journey of faith, for following Jesus. And you find these stories where Jesus heals someone and then he tells them to begin to walk. And that should be a picture for us of the life of faith, that Jesus heals us. He forgives us of our sins, but that's not the end of the story. We must get up and begin to walk. We must begin the faith journey. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. I would point out what Witherington says. Notice the artistic skill of the author in holding back until the end of the tale the information that this transpired on the Sabbath, giving it the rhetorically effective placement, the end stress, for the fact to be especially noted. So he could have told us at the beginning, he could have told us in the middle that it was the Sabbath, but he waits until the end so that it's kind of the punchline. We can insert, oh, I can see why this is such a big deal. It was on the Sabbath that Jesus told this man to carry his bed. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, it is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed. But he answered them, the man who healed me, that man said to me, take up your bed and walk. And we have some ironies here. The Jews excused the man for following the healer's orders, but they will not excuse Jesus for following his Father's orders. That's what we're going to see transpire shortly, and it is a very unfortunate irony. Also, the Jews are more concerned with one day, the Sabbath day, than the entire 38 years of this man's suffering. So these ironies are instilled into the stories here to make Jesus' opponents appear especially culpable. So what do we do about Jesus in relationship to the Sabbath? No one is going to read this and be like, well, Jesus is just a sinner who breaks the Sabbath and he just does that. Or there's got to be some other kind of explanation. How do we justify Jesus in terms of him telling this man to carry a load on the Sabbath? Well, Witherington is going to help us break down the main views on this. And so let's just go through them and kind of consider the veracity of each one. For one, he believed that he was bringing in the eschatological age when the final sabbatical rest would ensue and Sabbath regulations would no longer be in force. This would be something similar to Colossians. Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. We discussed this a moment ago, how Sabbath was a weekly thing. There was also a Sabbath year every 7 years, and then there was a Sabbath on the Jubilees. And the author of Colossians is suggesting that these are all pointing to the age of the kingdom of God, that Jesus brings the kingdom, and this whole thing is a sort of a Sabbath, and therefore the Gentiles are not required to keep Sabbath day regulations because the kingdom of God is its own Sabbath. Now, whether or not we can square John's gospel with Colossians is another story. Uh, Certainly, I do not see a tremendous amount of evidence that this is how John expects us to read the story. Withington continues, perhaps Jesus believed he was divine and so was not subject to such regulations. And then he dismisses it and he says this explanation is clearly too neat because Jesus was also human and a Jew and one who surely revered the Hebrew scriptures. So he's saying, look, you can't just get Jesus off the hook this way by saying, well, Jesus is divine, and so why would he have to do these things? Well, Jesus is also a Jew. He's also a faithful Israelite, which in the imaginations of anyone would certainly entail obeying the Sabbath regulations. Though Witherington dismisses this explanation very quickly, maybe it shouldn't be dismissed too out of hand, because there is a point coming up in this story where Jesus, in reference to the Sabbath, is going to say, my Father works, and therefore I work. Well, that could be saying that the divine imperative to continue working on the Sabbath, and there was a good deal of discussion about this in the Second Temple period, how God has to continue to provide some type of work on the Sabbath to sustain the universe, that though God continues to work on the Sabbath, people do not. And perhaps the divine imperative of Jesus to continue working on the Sabbath has overruled his human imperative to obey the Sabbath. The third explanation has the best supporting evidence. Jesus believed that he with his ministry was bringing out the true intent and meaning of the sabbatical rest, namely, relieving people from their burdens, both mental and physical, and thus healing on the Sabbath was carrying out the original intent of the Sabbath law. Sabbath was supposed to be helpful to people. It was supposed to have a healing effect. So if Jesus does something to bring this about, you shouldn't look for picadillos, little infractions. Oh, he's done some work here. No, he's actually bringing Sabbath into fullness when he heals someone. Now, the reason this is the best explanation, maybe there's a combination of explanations, maybe it doesn't just have to be one, but this is going to be the one that spearheads our justifications of Jesus' efforts on the Sabbath. And the reason why is because Jesus himself will employ this explanation when he talks about this healing. When we get to chapter 7, he's going to discuss his healing here on the Sabbath in chapter 5. He's going to say the following. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. So he's saying that when a higher principle of the Torah comes into conflict with a lower principle of the Torah, and you have to violate the lower regulation to uphold the higher regulation, this is not actually a violation of the Torah. It is not sin. You only circumcise a Jewish child one time in his life, on the 8th day of his life. You have Sabbath every week. Well, if the day of circumcision falls on the day of Sabbath, what do? Do you suspend the higher regulation that you only keep once in your lifetime to uphold something that you're going to keep on a weekly basis? Well, absolutely not. You suspend the weekly regulation to uphold the once in a lifetime regulation. And so Jesus and his opponents are in agreement here that when you do this on the Sabbath, that even though on a technical level you violated the Sabbath by performing an operation, in God's sight you have not actually sinned. The Sabbath is still upheld. Well, if Jesus uses this explanation himself, then we look back at this story. It's higher principle versus lower principle. Sabbath, at its core, was about bringing healing and rest. And if this can be put on display if people can know that true Sabbath healing has arrived by this man carrying his bed on the Sabbath, then the truth is Jesus is upholding the intent of Sabbath, even if it appears that on the most technical level he is violating Sabbath. He in fact is not doing so. Something similar happens in the Synoptic Gospels, where Jesus and his disciples are eating from the fields on the Sabbath day. And Jesus will point to the story where David and his men, even though they weren't priests, they ate of the showbread that was taken out of the tabernacle. It was not lawful for them to do it, but they were about to starve to death. And so we find that the principle of upholding life superseded even the sanctity of the tabernacle and the showbread. And so this explanation is employed in a number of places and likely accounts for the gist of why Jesus does what he does in this chapter. Yet there are still other explanations. Jesus replaces the institutions of Judaism with something superior and more lasting. He is the source of the world's rest. Moses' law is viewed as no longer binding on Jesus or his followers, having fulfilled its purpose and having become obsolescent, except insofar as it points to and testifies about Jesus. The Sabbath is good, but he is before Sabbath and above Sabbath and the source of Sabbath. This explanation, this sort of Old Testament, New Testament dichotomy that Jesus is replacing the old, I mean, you can come up with some support for this. Jesus is superior to the Passover lamb. He is superior to Jacob's well. There is a lot of supersession taking place in this gospel. However, this is a difficult explanation when it comes to Sabbath because there's no place in John's gospel where the insufficiency of Sabbath is decried. I mean, it's never like, oh, Sabbath is not enough and we need something better. If there was some place in John's gospel that said something like that, we could go with this, but there's not. And then finally, there are those who say, and you'll especially find people like this in the Messianic movement, who say that Jesus is not actually doing anything at all to break the Sabbath. He's not even suspending a lower regulation to uphold a higher regulation in the Torah. Rather, the only Torah he has broken here is that created by the Pharisees. There's written Torah, the Torah of Moses, and then there's the oral Torah, the traditions of the elders. And they'll say that Jesus is simply violating the traditions of the elders, not the traditions of Moses. Oral Torah broken, not written Torah. The Torah said simply that a person should not work on the Sabbath, but the Pharisees had developed in their oral tradition an elaborate classification of 39 types of work that were prohibited. Such work would only be allowed in life-threatening situations. Jesus was breaking the law because the man's life was not in danger, so they expected Jesus to heal the man the following day. Or so you can heal the day after the Sabbath, but not on Sabbath. Moreover, the man carrying his mat also constituted work, for moving things from one place to another was one of the 39 categories. The problem here is that in chapter 7, when Jesus is going to refer back to this healing, he seems to admit that his actions constitute a violation of the Sabbath if a higher principle were not at play. This is why he gives this explanation of circumcision trumping the weekly Sabbath. And so I don't buy this. Jesus doesn't say, well, I just violated your commandments, not those of Moses. Instead, he gives an explanation that sometimes lower regulations in Moses are suspended for higher ones. And so that's going to be the best explanation. And it holds across the Synoptic Gospels also. And so it brings option number 3, that we have the true intent of the Sabbath being brought out. And so we dismiss a lower regulation for the sake of a higher regulation. That just seems to be the best explanation across the board. They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. Jesus says, "Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." Now, this has occasioned all sorts of debate. What is Jesus saying here? Is Jesus saying that you sinned and this is the reason you were lame for 38 years, and now you've been healed. So don't sin again so that something worse doesn't happen to you. Is Jesus saying that this man's lameness and therefore all sorts of other sickness in the world can be attributed to a person's sin? Carson is in agreement with this perspective. The unavoidable implication is that the bad thing that had already happened, that is, the man's lameness, that had already happened, was occasioned by the sin which the person must not repeat. And so he and some other interpreters are just going to say, yeah, that's what Jesus is saying, that the man's lameness was caused by his sin. And in support of this, people will say that this story is putting the man's bad character on display, that he is specifically depicted as a scoundrel so that you can understand his initial lameness was caused by his own sin, by his own bad character. Some note that he did not take the time to learn who Jesus was even after Jesus has healed him, and that in the temple, Jesus had to seek him out because the man did not go and seek out Jesus. I don't know if you can really lay that at the man's feet. I personally do not see that. However, I think that maybe his complaining, but especially him reporting Jesus to the authorities in verse 15, are the basis of his guilt. And so we certainly do not get a good profile of this man. However, I do not think that the story is trying to imply that the man's lameness was caused by his sins. I think that something worse happening may be eternal, since eternal consequences are mentioned in verse 29. The worst thing that could happen to the man if he sins is not another health condition. It is likely eternal consequences, because that's where the conversation goes in verse 29 when he says, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment. Jesus, like other New Testament authors, believes that there is a judgment according to what one has done that is coming at the culmination of history, a judgment according to works. And how this might be reconciled with justification by faith through grace is a conversation I've had in a number of places, and I'm sure I'll have it here in John as well. But nevertheless, Jesus does believe that a judgment is coming on the basis of what one has done. Now, it should be counterintuitive for us to think that the man's initial lameness is caused by his own sin, because remember, this story is being held in comparison with the story in chapter 9. These stories are parallel. And in chapter 9, verse 3, Jesus tells his disciples that a man's blindness is not due to anyone's sin. So if we're specifically going to raise the question in chapter 9, hey, who sinned, this guy or his parents? And Jesus is going to say neither. Then how are we going to come back here to chapter 5 and begin to try to blame this man's lameness on himself? It just doesn't seem to work. This passage does not confirm or deny health consequences for sin, but is talking about something else. Now, it's okay to debate whether or not sin sometimes creates health consequences. Indeed, we can see that in certain instances, we'll take heavy drinking, for example, it certainly does cause health consequences. Now, as far as this man's lameness is concerned, there are other ways to read this that would square better with the context and with what we find there in chapter 9, where the man's blindness is not due to anyone's sin. If you get into a wreck and it's not your fault, you get injured, and then after you're healed, I see you getting into a car and you don't put on your seatbelt, and I come up to you and I say, put on that seatbelt or something worse could happen to you than the first time. Well, that's not me saying that the first wreck you got in was your fault. I'm just simply warning you that if you go away from that experience and you don't wear a seatbelt, something worse could happen that is your fault. That seems to be the case here. It's not that the man's lameness was his fault, but if he goes away and sins, then he will bring upon himself something terrible. That doesn't imply that the initial misfortune that he suffered was his fault. And I think that is a much more balanced and reasonable way to read this. Sin no more that nothing worse may happen to you does not mean that you are lame for 38 years because you sinned. It just means watch your step from here on out because there are eternal consequences for how you respond to your interaction with Jesus, as there are such consequences for all of us. And this is why the Jews were prosecuting Jesus. I've specifically used that word for dioko. It could be to persecute, but as we're going to see in context, it likely means prosecute, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." Many scholars, such as Ben Witherington, suggest that Jesus is going through a trial. He doesn't have to wait until he's arrested by the temple authorities. That there is a sense in John's gospel in which Jesus is always on trial. As Witherington says, from now on, the atmosphere during the rest of the narration of the ministry is dark and foreboding because of this ongoing judicial process. Indeed, Gary Burge has laid out for us how this chapter shows Jesus as being on trial, that it goes in three stages like a Jewish court proceeding. First, you have the crime, verses 1 to 15. A man at Bethesda is healed on the Sabbath. Then the man is interrogated, and then the criminal, Jesus in this case, is identified. After that, you have the decision to prosecute in verses 16 through 18. And this is why this word dioko, which can mean prosecute, I translated it as prosecute because of the judicial context here. You have the first basis that Jesus violates the Sabbath, and then the second basis for prosecution, Jesus is making divine claims. And then Jesus goes to trial, verses 19 through 47. Jesus describes his criminal work. Jesus brings witnesses in his defense. Jesus prosecutes his opponents, because in a Jewish trial, when your opponents come and try to prosecute you, you don't have to set a second court date, another trial, to return prosecution. If it can be shown that your opponents have prosecuted you on false grounds, you can begin to prosecute them right there on the spot, right there in that court proceeding. And so Jesus begins to prosecute his opponents. Jesus identifies their crimes, and Jesus challenges their ability to appeal. And so many scholars have seen this here, that John oftentimes places Jesus on trial within the narrative. That temporal things, temporal boundaries are not always respected. There's a sense in which Jesus is always on trial. You don't have to wait until the night of his arrest to get there. Some note that Jesus' opponents did not protest the magical pool at Bethesda healing people on Sunday. They were pagan enough to accept that sort of thing. They just don't want Jesus healing on the Sabbath day. They're okay with God working in a kind of impersonal way, a sort of pantheistic way, a kind of higher power way. But when Jesus comes and shows that God is working in a personal way, well, then they suddenly have an issue. As Brian offers this interpretive translation, "My Father has not set his power loose in the world to be accessed as an independent force, as though it's magic floating around in the Pool of Bethesda. If his power is at work in the world, it is because my Father is personally at work." Now, people prefer the language of pantheism or a higher power or something vague like that because they don't have to get personally invested. But once you acknowledge that your higher power is a person who expects a personal relationship with personal commitments, well, now that's unsettling, because now you have moral responsibilities. There are guys like this at the warehouse that I work in. They'll say, "Well, I believe in a higher power." Well, yeah, intuitively, using your intelligence, you recognize that there must be something above us. But you don't want it to be God, and you don't want it to be Jesus, because then you might have to do something. So if you just use the vague language of higher power, well, then that gets you out of commitment. And maybe there's just a tinge of this tendency with them. It's unsettling if God comes to work in a personal form in Jesus. They were just more comfortable with the magical pool that heals people from time to time, because that doesn't require any kind of commitment. He was doing these things on the Sabbath, but Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." In some texts, later rabbis declared that God finished his work of creating, but continued his work of judging. And so Sabbath, there's still judging going on. The Lord is still involved in acts of judgment, even though he's not been creating since the seventh day of creation. Yet the rabbis also recognized that God daily renewed his work of creation. In the morning Shema's first benediction, they recognized this every morning. In miracles, God could continue to create after finishing the creation, according to a 3rd century Palestinian Amora. Just as one may observe the Sabbath in one's own courtyard, God is free to observe it as he wills in his creation, a late 1st or early 2nd century statement. In other words, in Sabbath, you couldn't travel outward, but you could live your life in your own courtyard. Well, God, the entire universe is his courtyard. And so God is free on Sabbath according to this particular rabbinic interpretation. He continues to matchmake, thereby sustaining his creation. You work all week, but Sabbath day, when people are resting and feasting together, this is when you might find your mate. This is when you might find your future spouse. Indeed, you should sort of expect that that's what was happening on Sabbath. This is when you might look forward to seeing your suitor or the person that you're pursuing. A lot of people would be finding their spouses on the Sabbath days. And obviously, this leads to procreation and sustaining the creation. And therefore, God is still doing a type of work on Sabbath according to this text. Philo emphasized that God ceases from labor, but not activity on the Sabbath, which never ends with God because creation depends on him. So what's the point? Why are we putting all of these Jewish texts on the screen? Well, God continues to work on Sabbath. That was a Jewish consensus. So whether they describe it this way or use this particular instance or example is another thing. But what you can see here is that God is working on Sabbath. Well, Jesus says, well, God continues to work and therefore I work also. So it's not just that he's bringing out the intent of Sabbath, observing a higher regulation of Sabbath and dismissing a lower one. Rather, there is a divine aspect here that because Jesus is the extension of the divine being, he is going to do things on the Sabbath that others cannot do. Because God continues to work on Sabbath, and since Jesus is divine, he is going to work also. Now pay close attention to this verse. This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. So it says he was breaking Sabbath and making himself equal with God. What do we say about this? First of all, we point out a synoptic connection. This is the first time John mentioned the Jewish leaders' intention to kill Jesus. But the expression all the more shows that they had decided earlier that Jesus must die. So John is dropping a hint that they had already decided this. Well, this is good because it helps us square it with the synoptic gospels, which show that they wanted to kill him early on. So John hasn't reported it until now. However, the synoptic gospels have. And John uses this language of all the more to suggest that, yeah, they had at a previous point already decided to kill Jesus, as Mark suggested. Whoever blasphemes the name of the Lord shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him, the sojourner as well as the native, when he blasphemes the name, shall be put to death. So that's what they think he's done when he says something that makes him equal with God, that he is blasphemed, and indeed in chapter 8 they will actually take stones and go to stone him. Now here's the big question. When it says that he's breaking the Sabbath and equal with God, is that from the author's perspective? Right? Is it saying that Jesus broke the Sabbath and claimed equality with the Father? Now, if John is claiming that, if he's saying, yes, this is true, Jesus did break Sabbath, and he is equal with the Father, then that will affect how we read the following monologue. The following monologue will show that Jesus does in fact make these claims, that he is a Sabbath breaker, and he is equal with the Father, and that this is okay. Now, there's another way to read this. It's from the Jews' perspective. Jesus did not, in fact, break the Sabbath, and Jesus did not claim to be equal with the Father, right? It's just that they heard him as saying these things. They have misunderstood him as saying these things. Now, if this is the case, the following monologue aims to show that he is in subordination to the Father and that he is not breaking Sabbath and he is not claiming to be equal with God. So there's a huge debate here. When John says that he breaks Sabbath and he claims to be equal with God, is John saying, yes, he did these things? Or is he just saying, from the Jewish perspective, he seemed to be doing these things, though he didn't actually do these things? Now, that is the huge debate that we must have as we go into the monologue that comes next, which we will look at next week.